My name is Harper Blake, and for most of my life, I've been the kind of person who keeps her head down and pushes through. I'm 29 years old, a freelance graphic designer, and painfully aware that stability isn't something you can take for granted. I've spent the past decade bouncing between dingy apartments with peeling paint, noisy neighbors, and rent that always seemed a little too high for what I was getting. But I made it work because that's what you do when you don't have much of a safety net. That's why moving into the Whitaker felt like a victory. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. The apartment was a dream, a 2-bedroom loft with exposed brick, massive windows that bathed the space in sunlight, and views of the city skyline that made me feel like I'd finally arrived. When I first saw the listing, I thought there had to be a catch. A place like this, in a neighborhood that had recently become trendy, should have been way out of my budget. But the price was surprisingly reasonable, low enough that I didn't feel the need to ask too many questions. Sometimes, you just have to accept good luck when it comes your way. The Whitaker was an older building, the kind with character. Its exterior was all wrought iron and Art Deco flourishes, standing proud in a row of gentrified brownstones. Inside, the charm continued. High ceilings, intricate moldings, and hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot. It wasn't perfect. Of course, no building its age ever is, but it felt like the kind of place where I could build a life. When I moved in, I was determined to make the most of it. I spent my first week unpacking, decorating, and marveling at how much space I had. For once, I didn't feel like I was living on top of myself. I hung up string lights, filled the shelves with books, and framed prints of my favorite artwork. I even bought a few plants, confident that the sunlight streaming through the windows would keep them alive. The neighbors were polite but distant. Most of them were older, and I rarely saw anyone in the hallways. It was almost eerily quiet at times, but after years of thin walls and constant noise, the stillness was a welcome change. That changed when I met Valerie. It was my second week in the apartment, and I was still adjusting to the rhythm of the building when she knocked on my door. She introduced herself with a bright smile, holding a freshly baked pie as a welcome gift. Valerie lived across the hall in 3B and told me she'd been in the Whitaker for over a decade. "It's such a special building," she said warmly. "Not many new people move in, so it's nice to see a fresh face." She had an old-fashioned charm about her, blonde hair styled into soft waves, a floral apron tied over a sundress, and a demeanor that made her seem like she'd stepped out of another era. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to knock," she added with a wink. At first, I thought Valerie's friendliness was a stroke of luck. It's not every day you get a neighbor who bakes for you. But as the days went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about her was off. The first strange thing I noticed was the quiet. While I appreciated the peace at first, it soon started to feel unnatural. The hallways were always empty, no matter the time of day, and the building seemed to absorb sound like a sponge. Then there were the whispers. It started late one night as I was brushing my teeth. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe the hum of the old pipes, but as I stood still, I realized it sounded like voices. Faint, unintelligible murmurs, as if someone were talking just outside my door. When I opened the door to check, the hallway was empty. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only silence behind. The noises became more frequent after that. Every few nights, I'd hear soft murmurs, footsteps pacing in the hallway, or the faint sound of something dragging across the floor. Each time, I would rush to check, but there was never anyone there. I told myself it was an old building, that these sounds had logical explanations. But the feeling of unease grew. Valerie and I crossed paths often, and each time, her warm demeanor felt slightly less genuine. Her smile lingered a little too long, and her eyes seemed to follow me, even when we were just passing in the hallway. Once, I came home late from a client meeting and found her standing by my door, holding what she claimed was a package delivered to the wrong unit. She handed it to me with her usual smile, but the way she watched me as I unlocked my door made my skin crawl. One evening, I went to the basement to do laundry and noticed something unusual. Among the rows of washers and dryers was a heavy steel door with a large padlock. It was marked private, and the sight of it filled me with an inexplicable sense of dread. "What's behind the door?" I asked Valerie the next time I saw her. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Oh, just storage for old equipment and building records," she said with a dismissive wave. Her tone was light, but there was something in her expression that didn't sit right with me. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday night. I was curled up on the couch, working on a design project, when I heard a soft knock at the door. When I opened it, there was no one there, only a small leather-bound book lying on the floor. I picked it up, puzzled. The cover was cracked and faded, and the pages smelled faintly of mildew. Inside, the entries were dated decades ago and written in spidery handwriting. The author, a woman named Margaret, had once lived in the Whitaker. Her entries described strange occurrences, shadowy figures in the hallways, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. But the part that chilled me the most was her description of a neighbor named Eleanor. Margaret wrote that Eleanor had seemed kind at first but had a way of knowing things she shouldn't. The final entry read, "If you're reading this, be careful. She knows you're here." The whispers grew louder after that. They weren't confined to the hallways anymore. I could hear them in my apartment, growing more distinct each night. Then came the dreams. Every night, I dreamt of Valerie standing at the foot of my bed, her face twisted into something unrecognizable. In the dream, she would reach for me, her fingers impossibly long, her eyes dark and empty. One night, I woke to find my bedroom door ajar. I was certain I had closed it before going to bed. I decided to confront Valerie directly. It felt reckless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was at the center of everything. One evening, I knocked on her door, clutching the leather journal in my hands. She opened it almost immediately, her ever-present smile firmly in place. Before I could say anything, she spoke. "You've been busy, haven't you?" Her tone was calm, but there was something icy beneath it. "Come in, Harper. We should talk." I hesitated. Stepping into her apartment felt like stepping into a trap, but her gaze pinned me in place. Against my better judgment, I walked in. Her apartment was immaculate, styled like something out of a 1950 seconds catalog. Everything was perfectly arranged, from the floral curtains to the porcelain knickknacks on the shelves. It was almost too perfect, like a set designed to make you feel at ease. She gestured for me to sit at the small dining table. "You found Margaret's journal," she said, her smile never wavering. I nodded, my throat dry. "What is this place? What's happening in this building?" Valerie sighed, as if I were an unruly child asking too many questions. "The Whitaker is special," she said. "It's a haven, a sanctuary. But it requires balance, and that balance depends on the people who live here." "What does that mean?" I demanded. "It means some of us give more than others," she said, leaning forward. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And some of us take. It's the way it's always been." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I stood abruptly, clutching the journal to my chest. "I'm leaving," I said. Valerie's smile didn't falter. "You won't get far," she said simply. I rushed out of her apartment, slamming the door behind me. As I hurried down the hallway, I felt eyes on me, but when I turned, the hall was empty. That night, the whispers were deafening. They echoed through my apartment, growing louder and louder until I couldn't think. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. Then the lights went out. Plunged into darkness, I stumbled toward the door, gripping the journal like a lifeline. The whispers seemed to converge around me, circling like predators. My breath came in shallow gasps as I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight. The beam of light illuminated my living room, and for a moment, I thought I was alone. Then I saw her. Valerie stood in the corner, her features warped and shadowy. Her eyes were black voids, and her smile stretched impossibly wide. She didn't move, but I felt her presence pressing against me, suffocating and cold. "You should have listened," she said, her voice layered with a dozen others. I screamed and bolted for the door. My hands fumbled with the lock, and for one heart-stopping moment, I thought I wouldn't make it. But then the door flew open, and I ran. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air stinging my face. I collapsed onto the sidewalk, gasping for breath. When I looked up at the Whitaker, the building seemed darker, its windows like empty eyes staring back at me. The next day, I returned with the police. I told them everything, the whispers, the journal, Valerie. They were skeptical but agreed to investigate. When we reached Valerie's apartment, it was empty. Not just vacant, but stripped bare, as if no one had ever lived there. The steel door in the basement was another dead end. It was locked, and the officers insisted there was nothing unusual about it. They suggested I see a therapist, and I could tell they thought I was unstable. I moved out that same day, leaving behind most of my belongings. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. But even now, in a new apartment miles away from the Whitaker, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. At night, I hear faint whispers in the corners of my room, and shadows move where they shouldn't. I don't know if Valerie is still out there or if I've carried something darker with me. All I know is that I'll never feel safe again.